The asphalt stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of cracked gray hemmed in by barren desert. My car had been sputtering for the last 20 miles, the low fuel light blinking persistently. It was just after dusk, and the fading daylight painted the horizon in streaks of violet and burnt orange, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. I hadn't seen another car in hours. Even the radio gave up its usual static, replaced by a disconcerting silence. I cursed myself for taking the back roads instead of sticking to the interstate. Then, as if summoned by my growing anxiety, a flickering neon light materialized in the distance. Motel. The single word, spelled out in buzzing red and white letters, felt like a mirage. Relief flooded through me despite the odd sense of wrongness that prickled at the edge of my mind. The motel stood alone, a squat, weathered building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A crooked sign above the office door read, "The Sundown Inn," its bold lettering nearly obscured by years of dirt and neglect. There was no other choice, I had to stop. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the parking lot. It was emptier than I expected, given the late hour. Only one other car, an old blue sedan, sat near the far end. Its windows were dusty, and it looked like it hadn't moved in a long time. The motel office glowed faintly from a single hanging bulb above the entrance. I stepped out of the car, the dry desert air carrying a faint metallic tang that made me pause. The place was so quiet, I could hear the soft hum of the neon sign and the occasional creak of the old motel structure shifting in the cooling evening air. Inside the office, a man stood behind the counter, his face partially hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His features were sharp, almost too sharp, as though carved from wood and smoothed over time. He didn't look up as I entered. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. The man's head tilted slightly, but he still didn't meet my gaze. "One room?" His voice was gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. "Yes, just for the night. My car needs gas. Do you know if there's a station nearby?" His lips curled into what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Station's about 20 miles east. You'll find some in the morning." He slid a guest book toward me, the pages yellowed and brittle. I hesitated before signing my name. Something about the way he was watching, or not watching, me put me on edge. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if he were staring past me at something invisible. After a moment, I scrawled my name and handed the book back. "You're in room 6. He passed me an old-fashioned key with a rusted brass tag. "End of the row." "Thanks," I mumbled, eager to leave the oppressive air of the office. The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit, with the faint scent of mildew hanging in the air. The faded carpeting had a floral pattern that might have been charming decades ago but was now more unsettling than inviting. A low buzzing noise came from somewhere, maybe a flickering bulb or some unseen machinery buried in the walls. When I reached room 6, I noticed something strange, scratches around the doorknob, like someone had tried to claw their way inside. A knot tightened in my stomach as I inserted the key and turned the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, sparse room. The bed was neatly made, though the blankets looked thin and threadbare. A faded painting of a desert landscape hung crookedly on the wall above the headboard. In one corner, an old tube television sat atop a chipped dresser, its screen dark and blank. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sighed. This wasn't luxury, but it would do for the night. As I settled in, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I froze, my hand halfway to unzipping my bag. The faint crunch of gravel underfoot, the subtle shift of weight, it sounded like someone standing there, listening. I stared at the door, half expecting it to creak open. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, even to me. No response. The silence stretched unbearably long before the footsteps started again, this time retreating. They were slow, deliberate, fading toward the far end of the row of rooms. I crept to the window, tugging the thin curtain aside just enough to peek out. The parking lot was empty, save for my car and the old blue sedan. Whoever had been walking wasn't visible. I let the curtain fall back and turned, trying to convince myself it was nothing, another guest, maybe, or even the owner making rounds. But there was something strange about those steps, something almost mechanical. Shaking off the unease, I forced myself to unpack. The tiny nightstand lamp flickered occasionally, the bulb buzzing faintly like a trapped insect. I was pulling out my toothbrush when the TV crackled to life. The screen glowed, filling the room with pale, gray light. I turned to face it, my breath catching. I hadn't touched the remote, it was still on the dresser, untouched. The static hissed softly, almost rhythmically, as though it carried a pattern or language just out of reach. "Damn thing's probably on the fritz," I muttered, more to myself than to the empty room. I walked over and pressed the power button on the front of the TV. The static faded, the screen going dark again. I stared at my reflection for a moment before returning to my bag. It wasn't until I was brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom that I heard it again. Static. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the TV. It sounded farther away, deeper somehow, like it was coming from within the walls themselves. I leaned out of the bathroom doorway, the toothbrush still in my mouth, and glanced around. The room was empty. My bag lay open on the bed, the lamp flickering softly. Everything looked the same, but the sound persisted, an electric, whispering hum that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I spit out the toothpaste and grabbed my phone, shining its flashlight into the dark corners of the room. The sound grew louder when I moved toward the bed. It was coming from beneath it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hesitated before crouching down, pressing my face low to the floor to see. There was nothing there. Just a black, empty space. I started to straighten up, but then I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint impression in the dust coating the floor, a handprint. It was too small to be mine, and the fingers were unnaturally long, as though whoever had left it wasn't quite human. The air around me grew heavier, colder, and the static noise rose, louder and sharper now, like a hive of angry insects. I scrambled back, heart pounding, as a low creak sounded from behind me. The closet door, which had been closed when I arrived, was now slightly ajar. The closet door hung open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness, like a wound in the fabric of the room. My breath hitched as I stared at the narrow gap, half expecting something to slither out. But the door didn't move again. The static noise shifted, softer now, almost beckoning, as if it wanted me to look closer. I forced myself to stand, my legs stiff and unsteady, and grabbed the closet handle with trembling fingers. Before I could pull it open, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, an oppressive weight that seemed to fill the room. I stayed frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of a child's laughter, distant and muffled, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the motel. I jerked my hand away from the closet door, stumbling back until I hit the edge of the bed. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. That laugh didn't belong here, it didn't belong anywhere. Suddenly, the lamp beside the bed flared, flooding the room with harsh, blinding light. The bulb buzzed violently before shattering, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its screen the only source of light now. The weak glow illuminated the barest edges of the room, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. My hands were shaking as I shone the flashlight toward the closet. It was closed again. I needed air. Grabbing my keys and wallet, I practically bolted out the door, leaving my bag behind. The night outside was stifling, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, a faint, acrid smell, like burning wires. The parking lot was empty, but it didn't feel that way. Every shadow seemed alive, watching, waiting. The neon motel sign flickered erratically, the buzzing louder now, almost a roar. I glanced at the office, thinking maybe I could demand answers from the owner, but the lights inside were out. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. The laughter came again, louder this time, and it wasn't distant anymore. It was near. Too near. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the parking lot, but there was no one there. Just the two cars, my own and the dusty blue sedan. My stomach twisted when I noticed something I hadn't before. The back door of the sedan was ajar. Against every ounce of logic screaming at me to leave, I found myself walking toward the car. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam barely piercing the dark. As I approached, the door creaked open a little more, as if inviting me closer. Inside, the car was empty, no luggage, no signs of life. Just an overwhelming smell of mildew and something coppery, like old blood. The seats were stained, the fabric torn in places, as though something had clawed at it. I backed away, heart pounding, but something in the dirt near the car caught my eye. Footprints. They were small, like a child's, but they weren't right. The shape was distorted, the toes too long, the arches too deep. They led away from the car and disappeared into the shadows near the edge of the lot. A cold wind swept through the desert, carrying with it a faint, high-pitched whisper. I turned back toward the motel, desperate to get inside, but I froze when I saw the window to room 6. The curtains had been yanked open, and a figure was standing there. The figure in the window was indistinct, a silhouette bathed in the faint glow of moonlight. It stood perfectly still, but I could feel its gaze, cold and heavy, like it was peeling back the layers of my mind. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt rooted to the gravel. Then it moved. A slow, deliberate tilt of its head, as if it were studying me. The movement was almost human, but there was something jerky about it, like a puppet on frayed strings. I shone my flashlight toward the window, but as the beam hit the glass, the figure vanished. The curtain fluttered faintly, as though someone had just stepped back. I took a step toward my room, but my foot brushed against something soft. I looked down to find a child's stuffed toy, a ragged, one-eyed bear with patches of fur missing. It hadn't been there when I'd left the room. The faint giggle of a child echoed again, closer now. I whipped the flashlight around, trying to find the source, but the lot was empty. The motel loomed behind me, each window dark except for one, the office. A faint glow emanated from inside. The thought of facing the owner made my skin crawl, but I needed answers. Clutching the bear, I forced my legs to move, gravel crunching beneath my shoes as I crossed the lot. The office door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing the same musty room I'd entered earlier. The guest book still sat on the counter, but now the pages were flipping slowly, as if a breeze I couldn't feel was turning them. The owner wasn't behind the desk. Instead, the glow came from an old radio perched on a shelf in the corner. The dials spun on their own, landing on bursts of static interspersed with faint, whispering voices. One phrase repeated over and over, barely audible. "He always collects." "What the hell is this?" I muttered, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. I stumbled back, knocking into the counter, and the guest book fell to the floor with a heavy thud. When I bent to pick it up, the pages were no longer blank. Names filled every line, scrawled in jagged handwriting that seemed to bleed into the paper. My own name was there, near the bottom, underlined twice. My stomach lurched when I saw the dates next to the entries. Most were years, decades old, but the date beside my name was today. Something moved in the doorway behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the owner, or worse, the shadowy figure from my window. But the doorway was empty. The parking lot outside was still, bathed in the flickering red light of the neon sign. The stuffed bear slipped from my hands. "I need to get out of here," I whispered, bolting for the door. My car keys were already in my pocket, and my only thought was to leave this cursed place behind. But when I reached the lot, my car was gone. I stopped dead, heart hammering. The blue sedan was still there, its door swinging gently in the breeze, but my car, the only real lifeline I had, was nowhere to be seen. I stared at the empty space where it had been, the gravel undisturbed, as though it had never been there at all. Behind me, the child's laughter returned, louder than ever. I whirled around, and this time, I saw her. She was standing by room 6, a little girl no older than 8, wearing a tattered dress that billowed unnaturally in the still air. Her face was pale, her eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the faint light. She raised one hand and pointed toward the desert. My legs refused to move. What do you want?" I stammered. Her lips parted, and the laughter spilled out again, high-pitched, hollow, like it wasn't coming from her throat. She turned and began walking away, her bare feet leaving no prints in the dirt. The air grew colder with each step she took, and before I knew it, I was following her. She led me to the edge of the lot, where the gravel gave way to hard-packed sand. There, half buried in the dirt, was a sign I hadn't noticed before. "Welcome to the Sundown Inn. No checkouts." Behind it, the desert stretched endlessly into darkness, dotted with faint, flickering lights that didn't belong to any town. The girl stopped beside the sign, turning to face me. For the first time, she spoke. "You're his now," she said, her voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. The ground beneath me shifted, pulling at my feet. I looked down to see the sand swallowing me, inch by inch, as though the earth itself had turned against me. I screamed, thrashing, but it was no use. The motel loomed in the distance, its lights dimming, as the girl watched impassively. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the neon sign, its buzzing letters forming a final, mocking message. Vacancy. I thrashed against the sand as it pulled me deeper, grains clawing at my skin like cold, skeletal hands. The girl watched silently from the edge of the lot, her dark, empty eyes fixed on me as if she were savoring every second. "Help me!" I screamed, reaching for anything to hold on to. My hands found only loose gravel and dry air. The neon sign buzzed louder, its flickering red light washing over everything, painting the night in pulsing crimson hues. As the sand rose to my chest, the whispers returned. They seemed to come from all directions, hissing phrases that I couldn't quite make out. The girl finally moved, stepping closer to the edge of the pit that was consuming me. She leaned down, her small, pale face almost level with mine. "You belong here now," she whispered, her voice carrying an ancient, otherworldly weight. "No!" I gasped, clawing upward. My fingers found the edge of something solid, a buried piece of wood, maybe part of the motel's foundation. Using every ounce of strength, I hauled myself upward, fighting the sand's relentless grip. The girl tilted her head in curiosity, but she didn't move to stop me. She simply stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as the whispers grew louder. I finally pulled free, collapsing onto the gravel, gasping for air. My body was trembling, and the sand clung to my clothes like it was alive, reluctant to let me go. I staggered to my feet and turned back toward the motel. The building looked different now. The neon sign wasn't flickering anymore, it glowed steadily, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The office door was open again, spilling warm light onto the cracked pavement. But the most horrifying change was the windows. Every room now had a figure standing behind the curtains, their faces pressed to the glass. I couldn't make out their features, but I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry, like wolves staring down an injured animal. One of the figures raised a hand and pointed at me, the motion deliberate and mocking. I stumbled back toward the road, my legs weak and unsteady. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. My car was still parked where I'd left it, but the driver's door hung open, and something dark and wet glistened on the seat. As I stood there, frozen in place, the whispers reached a crescendo. A voice, deep, inhuman, spoke clearly for the first time. "You cannot leave. Not without an offering." The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the motel seemed to shift, its walls bending and twisting like a living thing. My gaze darted back to the office, and there he was, the owner, standing in the doorway. His face was no longer obscured by the shadow of his hat. His skin was stretched too tight across his skull, and his eyes burned with an unnatural light. His smile revealed teeth that were jagged and uneven, more like shards of bone than anything human. He held out his hand, palm up, as though expecting me to place something in it. "I don't have anything," I shouted, my voice cracking. The owner tilted his head, his grin widening. "You do," he said, his voice a guttural rasp. "You just don't know it yet." The owner's words sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back, shaking my head, but his outstretched hand remained steady. "I don't have anything for you," I repeated, my voice rising in desperation. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, forming a cacophony of voices that were no longer disjointed. They spoke as one. "There is always a price." The ground beneath me shifted again, and I nearly lost my balance. The motel seemed to ripple, the walls warping like a mirage. The figures in the windows pressed their hands against the glass, their forms growing more defined. Their faces were twisted, contorted with pain and fury, their eyes black voids that seemed to drink in the faint light. My body screamed for me to run, but the owner took a step toward me, his impossibly long shadow stretching across the lot. His grin widened, revealing more of those jagged, bone-like teeth. "Give yourself willingly," he rasped, "or the sundown will take what it needs." I spun on my heel and ran toward my car. The door was still open, the dark stain on the driver's seat glistening under the pale light. The whispers surged around me, rising to a deafening roar as I threw myself inside and slammed the door. The key was still in the ignition. I didn't stop to question it. I turned it, and the engine roared to life. As the car jolted forward, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The owner stood in the middle of the lot, his hands still outstretched. Behind him, the figures in the windows began to move, slipping out of their rooms one by one. They stepped into the parking lot like marionettes, their movements jerky and unnatural. The road stretched ahead of me, but I could feel the motel pulling at me, dragging at the edges of my vision. The neon sign buzzed louder, its red glow flashing erratically. "You can't leave," the voices screamed in unison, reverberating inside my head. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, the tires screeching as I tore out of the lot and onto the highway. The desert stretched before me, empty and endless, but the Sundown Inn refused to let me go. In the rearview mirror, the figures began to follow, their forms flickering like static. They moved faster than anything human should, closing the distance between us with every passing second. The car shuddered violently, the steering wheel jerking in my hands as though something unseen was trying to force me off the road. The whispers filled the car now, rising to an unbearable pitch. "Turn back," they commanded. "Give yourself to us." "No!" I screamed, slamming my hand against the dashboard. The radio crackled to life, spewing more static and disjointed voices, but I didn't stop. The headlights flickered, and for a moment, the road ahead disappeared, replaced by the swirling red and black void I'd seen in the pit outside the motel. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to stay straight. As I sped forward, the lights returned, and the motel was suddenly ahead of me again. It was impossible. I had driven miles, I could see the odometer climbing, but there it was, standing in the middle of the road, its neon sign flashing, the figures waiting. The car slammed to a stop on its own, the engine cutting out with a final, wheezing hiss. I screamed in frustration, pounding my fists on the wheel. The figures began to surround the car, their faces pressed to the glass, hands scraping against the windows with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. One of them leaned in close to the driver's side window. Its face was almost human, but the eyes were missing, replaced by swirling pits of blackness. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth too sharp and too many. "You're already ours," it hissed. I scrambled for the door handle, throwing myself out of the car. The moment my feet hit the pavement, the figures surged toward me, their movements impossibly fast. In the distance, beyond the figures, I saw the girl again. She was standing at the edge of the lot, her dark eyes fixed on me. She raised a hand and pointed toward the desert. I didn't think, I just ran. The figures pursued me, their whispers rising to a deafening scream as I bolted into the desert. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the horizon, where the faintest hint of dawn was breaking, casting the sky in muted shades of pink and gray. The ground beneath me shifted, the sand threatening to swallow me again, but I pressed on. The whispers began to fade, replaced by the sound of the wind rushing in my ears. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the motel was gone. The motel may have vanished from sight, but I could still feel it, its pull like invisible chains wrapped around my chest. The whispers had quieted, replaced by the relentless sound of the wind whipping across the desert sands. I doubled over, gasping for air, but the faint crunch of gravel behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. The figures were there. They stood just beyond the edge of the sand, their forms flickering like dying light bulbs. The owner was at their center, his face stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile. His hat was gone, and his pale scalp gleamed in the dim light of dawn. He raised a hand, beckoning me back toward him. "There's no escape," he said, his voice carried on the wind. "The desert belongs to us, just like you." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The sand shifted beneath my feet, and I nearly fell, but something hard and cold brushed my hand. I looked down to find the stuffed bear, its single eye gleaming with malice. I kicked it away, but the ground trembled, and a deep rumble split the air. The figures began to move, surging forward like a wave of shadows. I turned and ran, but the desert itself seemed to fight me. The sand softened, pulling at my feet, while the horizon shimmered and warped, offering no sign of safety. Then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, like firelight. It flickered and danced, calling to me. "Run," the girl's voice whispered, soft and urgent. I pushed toward the light, the whispers behind me growing louder, sharper, angrier. The figures were close now, I could feel their icy presence on the back of my neck, hear the scrape of their feet against the sand. When I reached the light, it wasn't fire. It was something stranger, a circle of glowing symbols carved into the desert floor. The air around it shimmered with heat, despite the cold dawn. "Get inside," the girl said, appearing beside me. She looked different now, less ethereal, more solid, her dark eyes gleaming with intensity. I didn't question her. I dove into the circle just as the first figure lunged at me. The moment my body crossed the glowing boundary, the figure shrieked, its form dissolving into black smoke. The rest of them stopped at the edge, writhing and howling in frustration. The owner stepped forward, his pale, skeletal hand reaching toward the circle, but when his fingers brushed the light, they burned, the flesh curling back to reveal jagged bone. The girl stepped into the circle with me, her gaze fixed on the owner. "You broke the rules," she said, her voice calm but commanding. The owner laughed, the sound low and menacing. "The rules are mine to break." "Not anymore," she said, raising her hand. The symbols on the ground flared brighter, blindingly so. The figures screamed, their shapes twisting and collapsing into the sand. The owner snarled, his smile finally faltering as the light grew, enveloping everything. "You can't escape the sundown," he hissed, his voice echoing as his form began to dissolve. "It always finds you." I shielded my eyes, the light searing through the darkness. When I opened them again, the desert was silent. The motel was gone, the figures erased, and the whispers had finally ceased. The girl stood beside me, her form fading in the soft light of morning. "It's over," she said, her voice faint. What are you?" I asked, my throat raw. She smiled, the first real warmth I'd felt since this nightmare began. "Someone who escaped. A long time ago." Before I could ask her anything else, she disappeared, leaving me alone in the desert. I eventually found the highway, flagging down a passing trucker who drove me to the nearest town. I didn't tell him about the motel or the girl, I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But as I sat in the back of the truck, staring at the endless road ahead, I felt the faintest hum of static in the air. And I knew, deep down, the Sundown Inn wasn't gone. It never would be.